Welcome to today's panel discussion, responding to unequivocal climate change, legal and policy implications of the latest IPCC report. I am Cary, the director of the Penn program on regulation, which is sponsoring today's panel discussion, and I am pleased to moderate this discussion with three leading experts on the law and policy of climate change. Now, last month, the media extensively covered the release of the first working group report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's sixth assessment of the state of the science of climate change. The IPCC is a scientific body situated within the United Nations, and it had last prepared an assessment of the state of climate science back in 2013. This latest IPCC Working Group 1 report from last month focused on the physical science aspects of climate change. Its summary for policymakers is about 40 pages long, but the report itself spans to nearly 4,000 pages in length. So everyone can rest assured that we won't cover all of it in today's discussion. But what we will cover is extremely important. And in fact, the report itself garnered the media attention it did because of some of the stronger, or maybe one might say plainer, language that it used to describe scientific certainty about our warming planet, its causes and its effects. The report states, for example, that it is, quote, unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, close quote. It further notes that, quote, global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, by the way, which are two key benchmark levels of the relative increase in global mean land surface temperatures from pre-industrial levels, the benchmark levels where there would be significant climatic, public health, and economic disruptions. Anyway, these levels, the report said, will, quote, be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. I think it was the UN Secretary General who was even more blunt about the report in saying it is code red for humanity. Now, in addition to the release of the official Working Group 1 report on the physical sciences, this summer also saw the unofficial leaking of drafts of the remaining two IPCC Working Group reports that are still to come with this sixth assessment process. And those leaked drafts also gained much attention in the media, and they seem to suggest that nothing short of massive restructuring of economies and energy systems can fully spare the planet from the most devastating effects of climate change. So to help us make sense of these various developments from the IPCC's latest work and their implications for climate law and policy, we're very fortunate today to have with us three of the nation's foremost experts in energy law and climate policy. Dan Bodansky is currently the Regents Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. He's also a visiting scholar this year at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House. He is a leading authority on international environmental law and previously served as the climate change coordinator at the US State Department. And he has also consulted for the United Nations on climate change issues. Next, Nat Keohane is the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which is one of the nation's top climate think tanks. Dr. Keohane previously led climate research and policy advocacy for the Environmental Defense Fund and also previously served in the Obama White House as a special assistant to the president for energy and environment in the National Economic Council and the Domestic Policy Council. And lastly, Shelley Welton, an associate professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law, is one of the nation's leading scholars of energy law and climate policy, who I'm also very pleased to say is affiliated with us at the University of Pennsylvania this year as a visiting scholar with Penn's Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. Prolific scholar, Dr. Welton previously served as the deputy director of Columbia Law School's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Before turning to these three panelists, let me just pause momentarily to let those of you watching this discussion live know that you can participate too. I invite you to submit questions via the Q&A button on Zoom. After some initial opening discussion, I will then turn to your questions and direct them to the panelists. So use the Q&A button to submit those questions. They will be visible to me, and I will use as many of them as I can in the discussion that follows. I should note that the Q&A button is different from the chat button in Zoom. The chat is activated if you wish to share comments with everyone attending this event. If you put something in the chat, though, keep in mind, it is visible to everyone. Of course, with that in mind, please keep those comments appropriate. So with these various introductory matters addressed, I would like to turn to the substance of our gathering here today and turn to our panel to get started. Nat, how about if I begin with you? You wrote a blog post recently, shortly after last month's release of the IPCC report, in which you described the report as both arresting and flush with warnings. Could I ask you to get us started by telling us, briefly what this latest report had to say and what were some of its key takeaways?
Sure. Thanks, Cary, and thanks to Penn for putting this great platform together, this great panel together. You mentioned a couple of the top lines already. I'll mention those plus another couple others. I think there were 4 points that I really took away. I mean, as you said, this is a massive report. It's a compendium of all the science that has been done over the past 6 years, and then of course all the body of science that was there beforehand. So it's hard to boil down to just a few points, but I think there are some that stick out. And for context, before I could highlight these, and I imagine Dan and Shelley will go into this as well, but the IPCC is built to be a conservative body in a sense. In other words, it is built to look backwards at the science. I mean, very rigorous way. It's also, so it's built only to look at really what's come out in the published literature, which means it's never at the cutting edge by design. It's what the consensus is in the science. It's also a political body, even though it's all scientists. It is a political body, and it needs sign off from all the scientists who participate. So for both of those reasons, you take everything the IPCC says and you say, okay, that's kind of the lower bound on the degree of alarm we should feel. And that's why the points I'm about to raise, I think, become perhaps even more striking. So of the 4 points, I'd have 4 top lines. The first, you mentioned really a change in language from the IPCC beforehand. Even in 2013, the IPCC was saying, well, scientists are highly confident that humans are changing the atmosphere. It's highly likely. In this report, they said it is unequivocal that human influence is changing the climate and is raising the temperature. And that word unequivocal is pretty striking, I think, in an IPCC report. And that's part of a broader point, which is we're sort of increasing the confidence about the physical science and narrowing the range about some of our predictions. But most of that also narrows, but also shifts the range to the longer we wait, the worse the predictions get. So that was the first point. Second point is that we're already seeing human influenced climate change in every region of the globe. Now, I think for everybody watching this, we have experienced intense rainfalls happening right now in the Philadelphia area. Where I am in New York, we've had, I think, set multiple records, it feels like, with rainfall in Central Park in New York just in the past few months. We've seen record wildfire seasons, heat waves, in Europe and elsewhere around the world, hurricanes intensity. So I think it's no news to any of us who are paying attention that the weather is getting more extreme, but it is also confirmed in the science. And so scientists are able to attribute those individual actions or the individual events to the effects of climate change. People used to say, no one event can be attributed to climate change. I sometimes still see that. That's no longer the case. We can attribute the frequency and likelihood of these extreme weather events to climate change, and we're already seeing that happening. Third point you mentioned, Cary, briefly, the world is warming maybe faster than we had realized or faster than had been appreciated before this. Without action, without deep cuts in emissions, we will cross 1.5 degrees and then 2 degrees this century. 1.5 degrees could come in the next decade or two, and 2 degrees by the middle of the century. So it's really crunch time to take action if we're going to avoid those thresholds. And then the final point that I would raise is some of the most, in a sense, the most terrifying part of the report is if you flip through and you look at the maps that show the projected impacts. Everything I said so far is about what we observe already, but the report also talks about what we can see ahead. The projected impacts are really terrifying. I just give you a couple of examples. Heat waves that are now 1 in 50-year events. So a heat wave that happens every 50 years under the current climate could happen 40 times as frequently. 40 years out of 50, you'd have the kind of heat wave that we now only have once every other generation. Extreme rainfall would be 3 times as likely happening. The kind of extreme rainfall, record rainfall periods happening much more frequently. You look at the variability. We talk about average temperatures, Cary, of a few degrees. It without action could be 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, but the Arctic could warm by 7 degrees Celsius, which is about almost 14 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are crazy, crazy projections, and they underscore the importance of action. The last thing I will say very quickly, we talk about thresholds. They are important. 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees are very important goals, but it's also worth remembering that every incremental reduction in warming we can achieve represents massive benefits. So every 1/10 of a degree counts on the way to meeting those goals. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nat. Yeah, and the report lays out 5 different scenarios, some of which do go to, as you say, those really extreme worst case scenarios. But it's one thing I find striking is that for the next 20 years or so, any of the scenarios are going to look about the same, and they're going to get us pretty close to 1.5 as it is, even under the best case scenarios, which makes it more complicated too, I think, for the legal and policy implications of all of this, which we'll talk about here today too, because these are going to be delivering changes and benefits that will accrue toward the end of the century, much more than they will in the immediacy of the next decade or so. But maybe to give us a little bit more perspective on the IPCC and its process, I could turn to Dan and ask if you could help us lay a foundation about the IPCC's role in the international climate policy process and what it, as an institution in a report like this, means for those who are involved around the world in climate policy discussions.
Well, thanks, Cary, and it's a pleasure to be here. And let me just say I agree with everything Nat said, and some of the points I'd make about the IPCC are very similar to what he's already covered. So the IPCC was established back in 1988 jointly by the UN Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization. So it has both a meteorological climate perspective and then but also formed by the UN Environment Program as well. And it's come out now with 6 assessment reports, going back, the first one in 1990, and then basically every 5 to 7 years since then. And as you said, it consists of 3 working groups. The report that came out last month was from Working Group 1 on the scientific basis, physical science basis, but then there are 2 other working groups that are going to be coming out with reports in spring of next year. Working Group 2, which focuses on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So it's going to be focusing on the impacts and adaptation aspects of climate change. And then working group 3, which will be coming out with its report in March of next year, focusing on mitigation. So this is the first of 3. And then there's going to be finally a synthesis report that tries to put it all together into one big package. But of course, those are going to come out post Glasgow. So the only one that's factoring into Glasgow, at least as a final report, is this first working group report. The other 2, as you said, have been leaked, but they're not officially adopted yet. So I wanted to just make, I guess, 3 points I'd want to highlight about the IPCC. So the first is the I in IPCC is important. It's intergovernmental. So it was created back in 1988 in part to reassert control over scientists because governments were concerned about scientists running around coming out with assessments, and they wanted to exert some control over the process. Governments have to approve the reports. The US is represented at the IPCC by the State Department, not by NOAA, which is the leading, or by the National Science Foundation, or by a scientific group. So you might think that's going to be a problem, that it has this government control, but I think the IPCC has done a remarkably good job in the working groups of keeping the scientific integrity of the process. So even though it has to go through ultimately a governmental approval process at the end, it's maintained its scientific integrity. And what the I has really added to the process, I think, is some legitimacy. So this is not just an independent report by scientists. This has intergovernmental buy-in. So it's harder for governments to just reject it because they have some ownership of the process. They're the ones who have to ultimately approve the reports. So I think the I has actually worked out to be, the intergovernmental part of it has worked out to be a net positive for it, rather than a negative, as I think it was originally perceived by some when it was created. So the second point is basically the one Nat made, that it's conservative. Sometimes it looks back, represents a consensus of thousands of scientists. I think it's sometimes portrayed by skeptics or conservatives as activist. I remember when I was climate change coordinator under the end of the Clinton administration, beginning of Bush. Bush was skeptical of IPCC, the people around him. So he asked the National Academy of Sciences to do a report on whether or not to believe the IPCC, thinking that they were going to say, well, maybe this is just UN science, we don't have to take it seriously. But of course, the National Academy of Sciences came back with a report completely endorsing the IPCC process and saying it represented a very credible process. It's far from being sort of out there on a limb, going beyond where the science is. It actually is backward looking and tends to be on the conservative side. It's behind where the cutting edge science really is in most cases. That's why it's so striking that AR6, the 6th assessment report, comes out with the kind of bold conclusions that Nat highlighted in his opening remarks. And then finally, the third point has to do with the role of the IPCC in the UN climate change process. It's not formally part of the process. The UN climate change regime has its own, was created by the General Assembly originally, not by UNEP and WMO. So the IPCC sort of sits outside of that, but basically provides the scientific assessments that then form the basis for the negotiations in the UN climate change process. So the IPCC has really been, I think, throughout the history of the UN climate change regime, the main scientific input. The second assessment report back in 1995 led to the Kyoto Protocol. The fourth assessment led to the Copenhagen Accord. Fifth assessment preceded the Paris Agreement. So even though it's not formally part of the process, it has a huge influence. And I think one thing that's interesting is that the Paris Agreement really now provides a hook, in a sense, for the IPCC to come in, because the Paris Agreement calls for a global stocktake every 5 years. And the global stocktake is to assess collective process and set the stage for the next round of what countries are going to pledge going forward. So right now, the IPCC assessment process isn't aligned temporally with the stocktake. The stocktake is going to be in 2023, and then it's going to be every 5 years after that. And one idea, I think, that really is worth thinking about is to try to align the IPCC assessment cycle with this stocktake cycle, so that there's a more seamless integration of what the IPCC comes out with and feeding into the climate change negotiations themselves. So thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks so much. And I guess, that notion of stock taking generates another question that we can ask about the IPCC report. I mean, as much as it is a report about the physical science of climate change. It is an assessment, and it can be said that it's an assessment of where we stand today. And Shelley, can I turn to you for some, big picture perspective about what does this latest report tell us about where the global community is today, or maybe more importantly, where it is not in terms of making progress in addressing climate change?
Sure, and I'll echo the thanks for putting this together and having me as part of it. I think maybe just to build off of what both Matt and Dan were saying, I think one of the things that's powerful about this report is that because it is this synthesis of 14,000 peer-reviewed studies, and it is conservative and it is politically approved in a sense, it is like a very reasonable benchmark against which to measure where we are and where we might be going. So I thought maybe it would be helpful if I kind of try to contextualize where we are policy-wise, both long-term and short-term, because I think it has things to say about both of those aspects. So longer term, one of the interesting things that I think comes out of this report is the IPCC really clearly endorses this goal of reaching net zero emissions, which is, they say pretty clearly that if we're going to stabilize the atmosphere at basically any level of warming, we're going to have to get to a place where whatever emissions we're putting out get canceled out by emissions that the planet is somehow reabsorbing, whether that's technologically or naturally. So their language in the report, which I pulled, is from a physical science perspective, limiting human-induced global warming to a specific level, so any level, requires limiting cumulative CO2 emissions, reaching at least net zero CO2 emissions, along with strong reductions in other greenhouse gas emissions. And this net zero concept has really become a staple around which we're framing a lot of global action. So right now, the way Paris works, and I'll try to make this very brief, and then Dan can correct me if I say anything wrong. The way the Paris Agreement is structured is that it is an agreement that's based around countries bringing forth their own pledges. So they put them forward in what are called nationally determined contributions. And the goal of Paris is that ultimately, as we build sort of collective goodwill and trust that people are going to meet their pledges, everybody will start to ratchet these pledges upward to a point where collectively we meet these temperature targets that we've set of 2 degrees or ideally 1.5 degrees. So if you look at these, what countries are saying they're going to do in the longer term, 137 of them have said that they're going to hit net zero emissions. And a lot of them are targeting 2050 as a date to do that. I think from a long-term perspective, the IPCC really kind of confirms that that's a reasonable track for countries to be on in the longer term. Okay, and then there's the shorter term, right? I think one of the things that both you and Nat pointed out is that the IPCC is this really, the report is this really alarming call about how quickly we are going to hit what are the ultimate targets we have set for maximum warming that we want. So if we continue on the course we're on, the report suggests we're going to hit 1.5 degrees of warming probably in the 2030s. And that means we need really, really rapid mitigation if we're going to possibly keep temperatures below that level. The report ultimately calls for something on the order of cutting global emissions in half by 2030 if we're going to hit 1.5 degrees, or maybe at least by a quarter if we're going to hit 2 degrees. And when we look at short-term pledges, as indicated by countries' nationally determined contributions that they're starting to put forward and update, we are not there. So the UN put out a synthesis report that basically looks at how countries are doing in these pledges, and it put out its latest update last week. And what it found was that if you take stock of all of these pledges and add them up, we're going to end up with about a 16% increase in greenhouse gases by 2030. Whereas what the IPCC says we need is to about cut them if we're cut them in half if we're going to hit 1.5 degrees. So that's a huge gap in a really critical decade in terms of what we need to see happen. I'll just say a word maybe about the US pledge. Domestically, Biden has created targets that are quite well aligned with what the IPCC is calling for. The US pledge offers a 50% reduction by 2030. The administration is also committed to a net zero goal. I think really the question here is, can they back up that pledge with the kind of domestic action that is going to give some credibility to the numbers that we're putting down on the page. So maybe we can talk about that in a minute. The last thing I thought that I might say on this question of how backing up as compared to this report is that there's obviously this huge discrepancy between ambitious long-term action that countries have committed to and short-term action that really doesn't add up to what the IPCC says we need in the next decade. And that suggests that countries are putting a lot of stock, I would say probably too much stock, in negative emissions technologies to sort of be the bridge that fills that gap between the next decade of inaction and ultimately hitting net zero emissions in the next few decades. And one of the things I think the IPCC report makes clear is that we absolutely are going to need some sort of negative emissions technologies, some way of getting carbon out of the atmosphere. I don't think we'll get to where we need to go without it, but I do think it's likely to be a pretty controversial element of upcoming discussions and of upcoming negotiations in terms of the extent to which we let countries rely on this sort of long-term planning action without taking short-term mitigation measures.
Thanks, Shelley. And I invite Dan or Nat, if you want to follow on and respond to that. Obviously, on the international front, Dan, we're in November approaching the 5th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, entering into force. And then you mentioned the upcoming COP26 meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, the Global Climate Summit under the UN auspices. What is likely to happen there? Is this, as I think Shelley's comments and the report make clear, really a pivotal time for the global community to come together and undertake action?
As Shelley said, really, I think the key issue is ambition and trying to raise ambition. And so that's going to be, I think, the benchmark that we're going to have to judge COP26 against in terms of seeing whether it's a success or not. So I think if you're thinking about COP26 and how this feeds in to that process, it's useful to distinguish sort of two parts of the COP. The COP serves as a meeting of the parties, and so it has an official agenda and a variety of things on the official agenda. And then it's also a big political event. And I think in many ways, that's the much more important part of what COP26 is going to be about. But the official meeting of the parties for COP26, what's on the agenda there, it's sort of wrapping up the loose ends of the Paris rule book, primarily rules on how the market mechanisms are going to work, and some of the rules about reporting under the Paris Agreement. These are not insignificant issues, but I think whether Glasgow succeeds or fails isn't going to really turn on whether those issues are resolved. And I don't think the IPCC report really has much to say about those particular issues. Those are pretty detailed issues revolving around exactly how the Paris Agreement's going to work on the market mechanisms and on reporting. But then I think the much more important part of Glasgow is going to be the ambition part of the agenda, the political agenda, really. And as Shelley mentioned, the whole premise of the Paris Agreement is that countries get to decide what they're going to do and put it forward in nationally determined contributions, but that there's an ambition cycle that drives up ambition over time. And I think the sort of the hope was that if you have these stock takes every 5 years and then a new round of NDCs, there'll be a series of political moments when there's a lot of attention on climate change, a lot of pressure on governments, and that countries, even though they don't have to raise their ambition, nothing forces them to, they're going to feel the pressure to do so, and will sort of put their best foot forward and sort of do as much as they can. So that's the premise of it. This was supposed to happen, the first of these 5-year cycles last year, actually in 2020, but the COP was postponed until this year. So 2021 has now become the central year. And so this is going to be the first real test of whether this sort of assumption or theory of the Paris process really works. And I think, unfortunately, the early signs are not super encouraging. As Shelley noted, a fair number of countries now have put forward new or updated NDCs. I think it's 86 new NDCs representing about 113 countries because the EU puts forward a common NDC for all of the member states. So if you look at the number of countries involved, quite a few, but a lot of those are very small countries that don't account for a lot of emissions. So if you add up what the effect of all those new NDCs is, it's relatively modest. I think one study by Climate Action Tracker said that the new round of nationally determined contributions put forward leading into Glasgow are going to reduce emissions by about 3 gigatons from business as usual. So that's an improvement. That's certainly nothing to sneeze at. As Nat said, one of the things IPCC said is that every amount you're able to reduce emissions, you have an effect on the temperature. So we don't want to write off 3 gigatons as not important. Nevertheless, it falls way short of what's necessary to keep temperature to 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees centigrade, much less 1.5 degrees. So it's clearly inadequate. And I think, unfortunately, even though the IPCC report is very strong, it's not going to have a tremendous effect between now and Glasgow, because I think what countries are willing to do is to some degree baked in at this point. I think if the IPCC were a little better aligned and came out earlier, there might be more time for it to have an effect, but coming out 2 months before, 3 months before COP26 is pretty late in the process. The big ticket item is China, because China is the biggest emitter. China just came out with a new announcement saying they're not going to fund overseas coal, so that's a big step forward. Nevertheless, their emissions are still increasing significantly, and so as Shelley noted, if you look at the effect of the NDCs through 2030, there's actually a slight increase in emissions. And I think of the overall budget to keep temperatures within 1.5 degrees, all but 50 gigatons is used up between now and 2030. And 50 gigatons is about 1 year of emissions. So we have about 1 year of emission past 2030 before you've used up the budget to keep temperature under 1.5 degrees. So that's why, as Shelley mentioned, negative emissions, I think, are going to figure very big. I think needs to be a lot more attention about how negative emissions will work under the Paris Agreement. And that's something that I don't think there's been enough work on. The other, just let me very briefly say, the other issue for Glasgow, I'm sorry, is the finance issue. Developing countries are dissatisfied with the level of climate finance that developed countries have provided. Biden just announced that he was going to double US contributions, so that's a step forward. That other big political issue, again, I don't think the IPCC report is going to be directly relevant to, but I think the success of Glasgow in part is going to depend on whether developed countries are sort of satisfied with the level of financial contribution that developed countries have put forward.
Nat, you want to jump in on this, maybe with a bit of more perspective on what the Biden administration is doing? You want to pick up those threads?
I will, but I'm gonna, you're always looking at a panel for a point of disagreement. So Dan, I'm gonna take a little more of an optimistic view, because I think you're putting, I don't think you mean to do this, but I'm worried that the audience might hear you saying that the Paris Agreement's not working. And I think that's a really pernicious message, because there are a lot of folks who would like to get rid of all the international framework, who would love to see that be the message. And so I'm going to have a little bit of a different take, while still absolutely saying, everything we've said about the urgency of action now and the need for greater ambition is absolutely the case. I think it's useful to look at the following. On the eve of the Paris Agreement, okay, if you look at Climate Action Tracker, Dan cited them, they're not the only group out there, but they do a great job of providing pretty simple estimates of where we're headed in terms of temperature based on current policies and pledges. If you look at the eve of the Paris Agreement, basically late 2014, before the announcement started coming in, we were headed, the Climate Action Tracker estimated the world was headed to 3.6 or 3.7 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century, okay? With current policies. The latest estimate is that we're at 2.9, okay, and if that's just with the policies that are already in place, and if countries follow through on their pledges, we'd be at 2.4. Now, you can still say 2.9 is a lot different than 2, and much more different than 1.5, and even 2.4 is different. But I would argue that we've actually made some pretty significant progress, and that is a sign that what I call the ratchet mechanism, what Dan calls the ambition loop, the requirement that countries come back to update their NDCs, that is actually having an effect. It's not fast enough. Guess what? This is a wicked problem. It's probably the hardest international cooperation problem we've ever faced. So we shouldn't be surprised that in 6 years we haven't solved it. Okay. But I think there's room to be a little bit more optimistic about the functioning of the Paris Agreement. And the reason I say that is because the worst thing we could do right now is to sort of throw it out and try to start some new negotiation, which is what a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but some people have been sort of trying to hint, because I think they just want to, not Dan at all, but I mean, I think that plays into the hand of some people who would like to just scrap the whole thing. Okay, so that's just a bit of perspective on the Paris Agreement. Now let me segue to the US. And I think the way to segue that is the area that, and this is a big one, right? The area that is most glaring in terms of the countries we have not heard updated commitments from, right? Are three of the biggest countries, emitters in the world: China, India, and Brazil. So I don't mean to say like everything's great other than China, India, and Brazil. Those are three of the major emitters in the world. And the fact that they haven't yet come forward with new commitments in that 2030 period is problematic. And I know that Secretary Cary is going to be traveling the world to try to press them to do that over the next month. And I wish him well on that. But part of the reason we're not going to see big announcements on the on new commitments in Glasgow is because we saw a lot of big announcements on new commitments back in April, and that was led by the U.S. making this 50 to 52% below pledge by Shelley. So that Shelley mentioned. So I think that part of the reason we're not going to see as much in Glasgow is because we've already banked some of the big changes that were made, at least by the U.S. and other advanced economies. Now the question is, how does the U.S. get there, and what are the prospects that we can actually meet that 50 to 52%? And that's going to depend, or a big chunk of that is going to depend on what happens in the next 4 to 6 to 12, 8 weeks, depending on what you think the details of the process in the Congress are going to be. It's going to depending on the fate of the Biden administration's Build Back Better package, the reconciliation bill that it's trying to get passed through Congress, along with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Both of those bills contain significant amounts of climate and clean energy spending. The reconciliation package really contains the bulk of that. And so making sure that the climate provisions in the reconciliation package, that those survive and are voted through, that's going to be really critical to getting on at least some track towards meeting that 50 to 52% target that Shelley laid out. It'll also be critical on shoring up American credibility going into Glasgow, and all these things are related, because one thing that makes it hard to really build up pressure on China and Brazil and India is people say, well, yeah, the US may say this now, but then in a few years they're going to go back. And so it's really vital that the Biden administration and Congress put the US on track to start getting, accelerating reductions in emissions so that we can meet that 30%. Big areas are going to be the power sector. We can talk about the details of the reconciliation package if there's time in a minute, but power sector is a big focus of that, because that's where the tons really are to be reduced in the next decade. We need to get to about 80% below 2005 levels in the power sector if we're going to meet that overall economy-wide target. The transportation sector is another big focus. Not as many tons in the near term, but lots of opportunity to start moving the fleet to electric vehicles, and that's going to be vital to meeting the longer term net zero commitment. And then the third big piece in the near term is methane emissions, which are methane is 80 times more potent than CO2 over a 20-year period. So actually going back to the very beginning of what you said, Cary, the one area where we can affect warming over the next 2 decades is methane. That is actually that's a lever we can move, that if we shift that dial or pull that lever, we can actually slow warming in the next 20 years. The carbon dioxide effects are baked in for the large part, but methane is a really vital area, especially in oil and gas. So let me stop there. We can go into the details later if folks want.
Sure, and an EPA rule just came out today in this area as well. Dan, before we move on, since you were at least invoked there as making something that could be misconstrued as pessimism, I just thought I'd ask if you wanted to respond at all to Nat's comment.
Well, first of all, let me say I'm a big supporter of the Paris Agreement, so I just want to dispel any doubt. that I'm trying to undermine the Paris Agreement. I think it's by far the best we can do at this point. And I think as Nat says, it represents a big step forward. And as I said, it's already reduced emissions significantly under the original Paris pledges. And then the new pledges that have been made this year are going to reduce emissions even more. And every amount you can reduce emissions has a big climate benefit. So that's all to the good. Nevertheless, I do remain, I guess, pessimistic in terms of Glasgow really representing the kind of reductions in emissions we need. We're, according to Climate Action Tracker, we're down to 2.4 degrees, assuming all of these pledges are in fact implemented and complied with. But and that's an improvement, but that's still well short of where we need to be. I mean, we're at 1.1 degrees and we're already experiencing severe climate damages. So 2.4 is going to lead to a lot worse damages. So I guess I think I would say maybe realistic about the likely outcomes of Glasgow. I don't think, if Glasgow doesn't achieve more than it looks like it will, it still is better than nothing by a long shot. We should keep pressing forward. I think actually climate is one of the areas in Biden foreign policy that's been a big positive so far. I think Secretary Cary's been doing a great job. So, and compared to some of the other foreign policy areas, I think it's definitely been a big positive. But nevertheless, trying to convince China to reduce its emissions is a heavy lift, and so far has not been.
But the whole Paris Agreement is not resting on the success of it is not resting on Glasgow necessarily.
No, I don't think if Glasgow doesn't succeed, we should toss out the Paris Agreement by any means. I think we should press forward and work towards the next cycle in 2025.
But Dan's talking about the kinds of climate effects that we're realizing today, and I want to turn to you, Shelley, because some of those climate effects, have manifested in disasters that are related to the power sector, the same sector that, as Nat says, we need to see large changes and reductions in emissions. But when we look at what happened in Texas this winter, what we saw more recently in Louisiana with power outages, sustained power outages affecting many, many millions of people, in the wake of some of these events, it's also cast a light on something that we really haven't talked about here yet. So far, we've been talking about reducing emissions, the mitigation efforts, but what about adaptation or resilience efforts? Is that an area where we need to be paying attention to as well?
I think the easy answer is just yes, but maybe I'll say a few more words than that. This isn't the focus of this IPCC report. It will be the focus of the second working group. So I think that will sort of shine a spotlight on it in a way that it hasn't been central yet. So maybe this IPCC report isn't the driver, but I think this summer and last winter in Texas, you don't need an IPCC report to tell you how horrific these blackouts have been for people, both in terms of human suffering and plenty of deaths. I think that we are seeing a really, really significant interest in resilience, particularly around the power sector, that we haven't seen in a long time. For a long time, I think people thought that the bulk power system just wasn't that big of a worry, right? That it used to be that everybody would just say, mostly when your power goes out, it's like a squirrel chewed a distribution line, or maybe a hurricane knocked out a distribution line. And now we're seeing that our whole system is actually really quite vulnerable to the kinds of increased severe events that Nat was detailing we can be sure that we're going to have based on this report. And so, I guess I would say that as I see it, if you take this IPCC report and combine it with what we've seen systematically across the US, it's pretty clear that we shouldn't really be doing any infrastructure planning or spending going forward without considering the twin aims of mitigation and resilience hand in hand. And I think one of the things that's been most problematic in the electricity sector in the last several months has been the way in which resilience is being pitted against mitigation, as though you can't have both things, right? One of the big talking points after the Texas disaster, for example, a lot of the Texas politicians came out and said this was winds fault, right? Like wind power failed us, and that's why our grid collapsed, when in fact it was pretty clear that it was a failure to weatherize natural gas plants that was the predominant cause of the blackouts in Texas, along with plenty of other things, including a refusal to connect the transmission system to the rest of the country. So, I mean, I guess the bigger point I would make here is that I think it's absolutely backwards to think of resiliency and mitigation as not going hand in hand with each other. There's just no way we're going to have a stable grid or stable other systems in this country if we're not both mitigating and shoring up resilience at the same time. So I think the real challenge for regulators now is to figure out, how do you do that, both as a matter of technology, right? Like a 100% clean grid is going to need some new technologies to make it resilient. And as a matter of governance, like what kinds of incentives do we need to put in place? Who needs to be working together that previously hasn't been? I think these are the really challenging questions around resilience right now in this country. The final point that I might make by way of opening up this conversation is to say we often talk about resilience very much in terms of infrastructure, in terms of building like the hard poles and wires of the system. But really, I think it's also a matter of the social structures that we're building, right? Like for how we give communities tools and households tools to cope with the stronger storms that we know are coming. And that all relates to a broader message that I think the Biden administration has really picked up on with initiatives like its Justice 40 initiative, which is that climate isn't just a scientific and a technical problem, especially anymore, but it's really deeply interrelated with questions of economic and social justice. And so part of solving it will be figuring out what kind of social safety net do we need in the climate era? What kind of local democratic ties do we need to give people in order to let them have communities that can respond to these kind of disasters?
Let me turn to some of the questions now that the members of the audience have put forward, some of which raise questions about global justice and how are the costs and benefits of climate change distributed around the world? And Shelley, you've just mentioned, a point that when it's domestically, we're talking about domestically, they're not distributed equally, but it's also a global problem. How does this this dimension of justice, the distribution of effects, complicate matters going forward? And I'll open it up for anyone who wants to respond to that. And what can we do to try to make forward progress, recognizing that there are these big disparities between who's contributing to the problem and then who is likely to bear the bigger brunt of the problem?
Well, I can offer two quick thoughts, Cary. I'm sure Shelley and Dan will have some thoughts as well. One, it connects to another question that was raised in the chat, which is about finance, which Dan also mentioned the importance of in the COP. So in terms of the politics of the international negotiations, adaptation, finance, and mitigation are very, very much linked together, precisely because many of the world's most vulnerable countries are the ones that have been the least, are the least developed and have emitted the least, and yet are going to be suffering the greatest impacts, and also have the least capacity to invest in building out their resilience and in dealing with the impacts. And so the pledge that Dan mentioned, President Biden's pledge to double climate finance, actually after an earlier doubling in April, he announced he would double it from the previous high, from 2.7 to 2 something to 5.7 billion. Now he's pledged again to double that to 11.4 billion by 2024. Of course, that requires working with Congress. So another area where politics matters in the US. But bringing that commitment and then obviously being able to follow through with it, but bringing that commitment to the COP, I think will be important. It also represents a six-fold increase in the amount of US finance that's dedicated to adaptation. Now, some folks will still say there's clearly a need for much more. And in some sense, the amount of finance we need to drive the transition and build resilience is, several orders of magnitude more than 10 billion. But politically, it's an important step in, I think, helping to plug this sort of gap in how in the negotiations, as you said, Cary, there's often been a focus on mitigation and not as much follow-up on the finance.
Yeah, and on the mitigation front, we've got some questions there about whether, for example, we have the right tools to actually drive emissions down to the levels that we need. A lot of economists would recognize emissions taxes, fees as really being a very cost-effective strategy. And we've got one question about whether there's any realistic prospect for effective mitigation on climate change without putting some kind of global price on carbon or other greenhouse gas emissions.
I was going to offer one other sort of like more provocative thought on the justice questions, and then
sure.
I'm happy to say a word about that too.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, I think one of the big questions, and this gets reflected actually in the IPCC assessment in terms of the various shared socio-technical pathways that they lay out that the world might be on. Like, I think one of the big questions around these justice issues is, what are we going to see nation states do as the effects get worse, right? And one option is that we really wall ourselves off and we protect ourselves at the expense of the rest of the world. And that's represented in one of the pathways that they put forward. And another is that we link some issues that are really critical together. Things like our immigration policy is deeply linked to climate change. And I think if we don't take a pathway that recognizes some of those interconnections, it's going to be much harder to build the kind of global trust around a shared future where we care about everyone and not just people within our geopolitical boundaries. On the pricing point, to really pivot gears.
Yeah.
I am totally pro putting a price on carbon. It has been exceedingly difficult to do at a level anywhere domestically, or even at like an EU cooperative level where it's able to drive the kinds of systematic changes that we need. So I think even domestically, like, I'm pretty like agnostic about how we get there. I think we need a policy that drives deep decarbonization quickly. And maybe that is the kind of payment program that right now is in the reconciliation bill. Maybe it's carbon pricing. I think any of that would be to the good. Do we need a global carbon price? I think it would be nice, but given the politics of even getting it domestically, I feel pretty skeptical there. I do think there's a lot that can be done with border adjustments, right? So basically recognizing when products come into your borders, whether or not there is a price in the place that they are coming from, is maybe like a more realistic geopolitical tool to work on pushing nations towards pricing.
Cary, I'd love to come in on the carbon price piece just briefly.
Yeah.
You probably weren't surprised to hear that. I would distinguish between a global carbon price, if by that is meant a negotiated carbon price through some sort of international agreement. The prospects of that are zero. But I don't think we need a global carbon price to still have the benefit of policies both at the national and subnational level, as well as the international level, that help create the same kind of economic incentives, either through a direct carbon price or through an explicit carbon price that comes in the form of emissions trading. I'm more bullish about this, not surprisingly. The EU's policy actually is working. I mean, it is driving things down, and we shouldn't expect that carbon pricing is going to be the only thing that matters. I agree. Sometimes in the past, economists, including myself, have sounded as if we said all you need is a carbon price. That's clearly not the case, if only because for two reasons. One is that's not going to be sufficient to drive all of the innovation we need. And second, politically, we're not going to get a price that can do it all by itself. But the European Union has reformed and strengthened its emissions trading system. That is now trading at a level that is that's having real impacts on emissions. California has an emissions trading system that's helping it achieve one of the most ambitious targets in the advanced world. And I think right now, actually, the Senate Finance Committee is discussing, as part of the reconciliation package, they're discussing a modest carbon price. I think the shift we need to make is it's not a global carbon price that's uniform everywhere at $80, $100 a ton or nothing. There is a lot we can get done with economic incentives through carbon pricing that help align everything else in the direction of a low carbon economy. And if we do that, even if it's a lower carbon price than ideally we'd like, that will make everything else work better. It'll make all the other regulations, investments, all the other things you want to put in place, because they'll be swimming with the current of economic incentives rather than against it.
Let me turn to one last question. Oh, go ahead, Dan. Do you want to comment on this?
Just quickly. So I would agree there's no chance politically of a global carbon tax. The Paris Agreement is completely agnostic about what domestic measures countries do. So allow countries to take into account their national circumstances. So I think some will follow a carbon price like the EU with their trading system. Others will take different regulatory approaches. And there are a lot of different ways of getting to reducing carbon, one of which is through pricing, but others also through regulation, other means. On the global justice issue, I think justice, the sense of injustice has been really a persistent problem throughout the negotiations. The negotiations really are marked by a lack of trust between countries. It's a very, very tortuous process because countries don't really accept that we're all in it together and all have an incentive to deal with the problem. And that's, I think, in significant part because developing countries don't feel like developed countries have really done what they said they're supposed to be doing, which is take the lead in reducing emissions significantly and providing finance. And so I think that's why I think the finance issue is an important one for Glasgow's success in going forward, because I think unless developing countries have a better feeling that developed countries are really stepping up to the plate, they're going to be very resistant to agreeing to things.
I want to try to squeeze in one more question before we go, because I think to probably members of the audience who are wondering about how we can drive the decarbonization, Shelley, that you talked about, whether that's realistic in the short run for technological reasons. And the question really is, do we have the technology now? Are we likely to have it in the near term to deal with energy storage, which would need to somehow accompany a dramatic shift to renewable energy sources? Is that in something that we can realistically expect? Shelley, you want to take that up first?
Sure. I mean, I think that the brief answer is yes, we can do it. There was a study out of Berkeley last year that said we can basically get to 85% decarbonized by 2035 while saving people money. And the last 15% is trickier. I don't think we have the storage we need today to do everything with renewables and storage alone, but we have a little bit of time to figure out how to squeeze that last little bit out of the system, right? And the fact that we could get to almost full decarbonization in the next 15 years with the technologies we have suggests it's really just us standing in our own way.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's a story of two chapters. You can get deep decarbonization with the existing technologies. And what we need to do right now is be investing in the innovation very broadly, not just energy storage, but every possible arrow in the quiver, which would include carbon capture, it would include fusion. If you read the news coming out of Boston, it would include advanced nuclear, which has some concerns, but might be a possibility. We need to be investing in all of those innovations now, so that when we reach 2030 or 2035 and we've run to the end of those existing technology deployment, we have that zero carbon ready to take us the rest of the way. And that's going to be critical, especially for industries, which are going to need new technologies as well, like steel and cement, to produce those goods without carbon emissions.
And to bring it back to a point Shelley started us out with, also some research on negative emissions, I would assume would also be in the cards as well. We are at the end of our appointed time here. I know we could continue to go much more. I'm sorry to those who've asked questions and we didn't have time to get to, but I want to thank each of our panel members for taking the time to be with us today, for giving us a realistic, but also I think ending on a hopeful note that we have the technology, we can do this. We need to gather up the will and build the trust and resolve some of those concerns about global justice that are standing in the way of making forward movement. With that, we will conclude our discussion today with my many thanks to Shelley, to Dan, and to Nat for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks, Cary. It was great.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining.